The water is perfectly still. It has been still for centuries. You descend a staircase into the earth beneath one of the most visited cities on the planet, and the noise of the surface disappears almost immediately. The crowds, the tram lines, the vendors, the minarets catching the afternoon light, all of it vanishes. What replaces it is something older, something that was never meant to be forgotten, and yet somehow was. You are standing inside a forest of stone columns, 336 of them, each one rising from the dark water below and disappearing into a vaulted ceiling above. The air smells of moisture and old stone. Somewhere in the distance, water drips. The sound carries further than it should. Everything here carries further than it should. This is the Basilica Cistern, and the city of Istanbul has been walking over it for nearly 1,500 years without fully understanding what it is. Istanbul sits at a crossing point between worlds. It always has. The Bosphorus Strait cuts through it like a wound, separating Europe from Asia, and for thousands of years, whoever controlled this narrow stretch of water controlled the movement of people, goods, and power across 2 continents. The Romans knew this. The Byzantines built their empire on it. The Ottomans took it by force in 1453 and never let go. The city above ground tells that history with confidence. You see it in the Hagia Sophia, which has been a cathedral, a mosque, a museum, and a mosque again. You see it in the Grand Bazaar, where trade routes that once connected China to Rome converge in a labyrinth of vaulted shops. You see it in the Topkapi Palace, the old city walls, the Byzantine mosaics that survived conquest by being plastered over and forgotten. But the city underground tells a different kind of story, and this one is harder to find. Beneath the streets of the old city, beneath the foundations of churches and mosques and apartment blocks, there is a hidden infrastructure that most visitors never encounter. Tunnels, drainage channels, subterranean passages that connected the palace districts to the harbor, and cisterns, dozens of them, possibly more, carved and built beneath the city over centuries of continuous habitation. The Basilica Cistern is the largest surviving underground water reservoir in Istanbul, possibly in all of Europe. And when you descend into it, you stop thinking about water infrastructure almost immediately. The structure was built during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, most likely around 532 AD, though some historians believe earlier cisterns may have occupied the same site before that. Justinian was the emperor who rebuilt the Hagia Sophia after it burned. He was the emperor who attempted, with partial success, to restore the old borders of the Roman Empire. He was also the emperor who understood deeply and practically that a great city required a reliable water supply, and that a reliable water supply required redundancy, storage, and the capacity to outlast a siege. Constantinople, as Istanbul was then called, was supplied by aqueducts running in from the surrounding hills. The longest of these, the Valens Aqueduct, still stands in fragmentary form above the modern streets. But aqueducts are vulnerable. They can be cut. They can be damaged. They can fail. And so the Byzantines built cisterns, underground reservoirs that could hold enough water to keep the city alive if the aqueducts were severed during an enemy attack. The Basilica Cistern could hold approximately 80,000 cubic meters of water. That is not a small number. That is enough water to fill dozens of Olympic swimming pools, quietly sitting beneath the streets, waiting to be needed. To build a space that large underground, you need structure, you need columns, you need arches, you need engineering that can bear the weight of the city above while holding the water below. The Byzantine builders solved this problem elegantly, using a grid of marble columns arranged in 12 rows of 28, each column rising about 9 meters from the floor, connected at the top by arches that form a vaulted ceiling of brick and mortar. The whole structure is waterproofed with a special hydraulic plaster applied to the walls and floor to keep the contents from seeping into the earth. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and for most of its life, the people who walked over it every day had no idea it was there. This is where the official story begins to feel incomplete. The Byzantines who built the cistern knew where it was. They maintained it. They used it. Water was pumped in through channels connected to the aqueduct system and drawn out for use by the imperial palace complex nearby. For several centuries, the cistern served its intended purpose, quietly and invisibly, beneath the streets of one of the most populated cities on earth. Then the Ottoman conquest of 1453 changed everything. When Mehmed II took Constantinople, the city was reorganized around new priorities, new rulers, and new infrastructure. The Ottomans built their own water systems. They developed the Taksim water distribution system centuries later, creating new pipes and channels to serve the growing Ottoman city. The old Byzantine infrastructure slowly fell out of use, fell out of record, and fell out of memory. By the 16th century, the Basilica Cistern had become something remarkable in the history of urban infrastructure, a major subterranean reservoir of 80,000 cubic meters, located in the center of one of the world's largest cities that virtually nobody knew about. Or almost nobody. The French traveler and naturalist Petrus Gillius spent years in Istanbul in the mid-16th century, studying the city's Byzantine past. He began to hear strange rumors. Local residents, he discovered, were reaching through openings in their floors and drawing up water and fish from beneath their homes. Gillius followed the rumors. He found the openings. He found boats. And he descended into the darkness and discovered the cistern, which had been sitting there, largely intact, for over 1,000 years. His account of what he found: a vast underground chamber, flooded and dark, filled with rows of columns disappearing into the water, reads like the description of a fever dream. He wrote about it carefully, methodically, and with clear astonishment. For Gillius, the cistern was proof that the Byzantine city still existed, not in ruins above ground, but preserved below it, invisible and intact. What he did not know, what no one knew for centuries after him, was that the columns in the cistern were not uniform. They had not been carved specifically for this space. They had been taken from somewhere else. Byzantine builders were practical in ways that modern builders rarely have to be. When they needed materials, they often took them from older structures. The marble columns in the Basilica Cistern came from various locations across the Roman world, many of them from pagan temples that had been decommissioned, dismantled, or destroyed as Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire. The columns arrived with their histories already written into them, in styles, dimensions, and decorative details that do not quite match each other because they were never meant to match. Walk through the cistern today and you can see this clearly in the variation between columns. Some are plain, unadorned. Others are more elaborate. Some show wear from their previous lives in a way that their positions here do not explain. But the columns are not the strangest part. In the far northwestern corner of the cistern, in shallow water, there are two column bases that stop visitors in their tracks. They are not carved pedestals. They are not decorative bases cut for this space. They are heads. Enormous carved stone heads, each one roughly a meter in height, each one depicting a face that archaeologists and historians have been debating for decades. They are Medusa heads, the figure from Greek mythology, the Gorgon, the snake-haired woman whose gaze could turn living men to stone. One of the heads sits on its side. The other is inverted, positioned upside down. Both serve as column bases, the marble columns rising from the carved faces as if the weight of the stone were deliberately pressing down on something that needed to be held in place. Why are they positioned this way? The answers that exist are careful and mostly speculative. Some researchers suggest the positioning was purely practical. The heads happened to be the right size and shape to serve as bases, and their orientation was determined by the dimensions of the space, not by symbolism. Others argue there was intentional meaning in the inversion, that the early Christian builders of the cistern were symbolically subduing a figure associated with paganism, pressing the old mythology beneath the weight of the new order. Still others point to ancient apotropaic traditions, beliefs that the image of Medusa itself had protective power, that her gaze, even in stone, even inverted, could ward off evil from the water below. The honest answer is that no one knows with certainty. The builders left no written record of why the Medusa heads were placed as they were. They have simply remained there, eyes open, for 15 centuries, holding up their columns in the dark. The cistern was cleaned and restored in the 1980s, and then opened properly to the public. That process revealed how much had accumulated in the centuries of neglect and semi-abandonment. The water was pumped out. Workers removed enormous quantities of mud, sediment, and debris. Fish were found, descendants of populations that had been living in the cistern for generations without human contact. Many of the columns, it turned out, were standing in water only partially by design. Centuries of silt had raised the floor level significantly, meaning the original depth of the cistern was greater than what visitors see today. The restoration also revealed something about the structure's integrity that surprised engineers. Despite the earthquakes that have struck Istanbul repeatedly over the centuries, this is one of the most seismically active regions in the world. The cistern had survived essentially intact. The Byzantine engineering had held. The arches, the columns, the waterproofing, the foundations, all of it had endured not just centuries of neglect, but the geological violence of repeated seismic events, including earthquakes that caused significant damage to buildings above ground. There is a stillness to the cistern now that feels earned. It feels like something that has lasted. The Basilica Cistern did not exist alone. Istanbul's underground world is far more extensive than most people realize. The city has dozens of documented cisterns, some large, some small, some still flooded, some long dried out and converted to other uses. The cistern of Philoxenos, also known as the Binbirdirek cistern or cistern of 1,001 columns, sits not far from the Basilica Cistern and was at various points in history used as a silk spinning workshop, a horse stable, and eventually a cafe. Its columns, unlike those in the Basilica Cistern, are stacked in 2 tiers, and the interior has a very different quality. Taller, narrower between columns, more claustrophobic. There are also cisterns beneath private buildings, beneath mosques, beneath old Byzantine palaces that no longer stand above ground but whose foundations are still visible below the surface. Urban archaeologists working in Istanbul regularly encounter unexpected subterranean spaces during construction projects, and the city has developed specific protocols for managing the discoveries, because the discoveries are routine enough to require protocols. Below the cisterns, some researchers believe there may be additional layers, older construction, earlier infrastructure. The history of habitation on this peninsula stretches back long before the Byzantine Empire, and the geology beneath the old city has not been fully mapped. Some passages that appear in Byzantine records as tunnels connecting major buildings have never been definitively located. Whether they survive, were destroyed, were sealed, or simply haven't been found, yet remains an open question. The deeper the story goes, the more incomplete the map becomes. There is a passage in certain Byzantine chronicles that refers to tunnels connecting the great palace of Constantinople to the cisterns and to the harbor. The Great Palace was the imperial complex that stood on the hill overlooking the Bosphorus, roughly where the Topkapi Palace now stands, and it was the administrative and residential center of the Byzantine Empire for nearly 1,000 years. A complex that large, occupied continuously for that long, would almost certainly have required subterranean infrastructure, service passages, drainage, storage, escape routes. Parts of the Great Palace have been excavated. Mosaic floors from the imperial complex, extraordinarily detailed and beautifully preserved, were discovered beneath a later building and are now displayed in a small museum near the Blue Mosque. But the full extent of the palace's underground levels has never been mapped. Most of it remains beneath streets, foundations, and buildings that cannot simply be demolished to satisfy archaeological curiosity. What exists below those streets is a matter of ongoing debate, careful excavation, and patient uncertainty. Some historians point to the historical record of sieges in which Constantinople held out for months or years against attackers who had cut off the aqueducts, and suggest this is only possible if the water storage capacity was even larger than what has been found. If that is true, there are cisterns beneath Istanbul that have not yet been rediscovered. They may be flooded, they may be collapsed, they may be sitting beneath buildings that have stood for 5 centuries with no idea what they rest on. That is not a reassuring thought if you happen to be standing in one of those buildings. Visitors to the Basilica Cistern today walk on raised wooden platforms that keep them above the water. The platforms lead through the columns in a prescribed route, past the Medusa heads, past a section of column that bears a carved peacock eye pattern, past the single column that is covered in carved tears or droplets, which is often called the weeping column and is said, by local tradition, to commemorate the slaves who died during the cistern's construction. There is no historical confirmation of that story, but it persists. The light in the cistern now is theatrical, carefully controlled. Colored lights play across the water and the columns. Music, ambient, slightly eerie, drifts through the space. It is designed to feel mysterious, and it succeeds, though the effect is somewhat different from what early visitors to the restored cistern experienced, when it was quieter and stranger and more genuinely unsettling. Even with the theatrical lighting and the tourist route and the gift shop at the exit, something in the cistern resists domestication. It is too large, too old. The columns recede into the dark at the edges of the space in a way that the lighting cannot fully reach. There are parts of the cistern that you can see but not access, where the water lies undisturbed and the ceiling presses down and nothing has moved in a very long time. Stand still long enough near the Medusa heads, with the water reflecting the columns in the dim light around you, and the tourist experience falls away. What replaces it is harder to name. It is something closer to the feeling of being inside a place that was built for a purpose far more serious than your visit. The water in this cistern was meant to keep a city alive. The city it was meant to keep alive no longer exists by that name. The empire that built it collapsed. The religion that gave it symbolic meaning was later overlaid by another religion. The political world that justified its construction, sieges, empires, walls, water as a strategic resource, has transformed beyond recognition. And yet, the cistern remains. The columns are still standing. The Medusa heads are still down there, in the water, holding everything up. There is a broader truth that the Basilica Cistern makes visible if you let it. Cities are not what we see on the surface. They are accumulations. Every street in Istanbul is built over something older. Every foundation reaches down through layers of Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, and pre-Ottoman construction, through pottery shards and coins and building stone and human bone, down to bedrock that was here long before any of it. The cistern is simply the largest and most intact piece of that accumulation that has been made accessible, but it is not the whole story. It may not even be the oldest layer. What remains underground in Istanbul is not simply a curiosity, it is an archive. An incomplete one, damaged by time and earthquake and construction and deliberate destruction, but an archive nonetheless. Every time a foundation is dug in the old city, another page of that archive turns. Sometimes what surfaces is expected, sometimes it is not. And sometimes, like the cistern, it has been there all along, holding still in the dark, waiting for someone to descend. The water drips, the columns hold, the city moves above, and somewhere beneath the streets, in flooded chambers that no map yet marks, there may be more.